Malaga Radio.
Freshly squeezed.
The juice on all the daily events along the coast.
With just a little bit of zest.
You're listening to the Málaga Radio Weekly Diary, your guide to what's happening across Málaga and the Costa del Sol for the week ahead. I'm Carmen.
And I'm Baptiste. And every week here on Málaga Radio, we pull together the events, festivals, concerts, food, culture, and local atmosphere shaping the region over the next 7 days. So whether you live here, you're visiting for a few days, or you're planning your week from somewhere beside the sea right now, this is where we help you connect the dots properly.
Because the Costa del Sol changes mood very quickly at this time of year.
One week it still feels like spring, and then suddenly the terraces are full again, concerts are returning beside the sea, villages are holding outdoor celebrations, and the whole region starts behaving like summer is quietly arriving underneath everything.
And this week honestly feels like one of those turning points. Because across the next few days, we've got La Noche en Blanco, transforming Malaga City after dark, San Isidro, celebrations moving through towns across Andalucía, food festivals in Ronda, concerts returning to the coast, and outdoor life across the entire region accelerating again after a very unsettled spring period.
And alongside the weekly diary each week, don't forget we're also live every morning with Freshly Squeezed here on Malaga Radio. Following the weather, events, traffic, nightlife, beaches, festivals, and daily rhythm of the Costa del Sol as it actually happens.
Plus, over 200 podcasts now available across all the Malaga Radio series, including Active Adventures, Town in Focus, Spotlight, wellness features, local guides, and deep dives into towns all across the region.
So wherever you're listening from this week,
let's step into the Costa del Sol together. This is the Malaga Radio Weekly Diary for week 20, May 11th to the 17th.
Malaga Radio.
You're listening to the Malaga Radio Weekly Diary. And this week, Malaga becomes a different city after dark.
Because next Saturday night, for 5 hours, the normal rules of the city quietly disappear. Cars vanish from the center, museums stay open until late, music starts pouring out from balconies above Calilarios, projections begin climbing across old stone buildings, and hundreds of thousands of people slowly drift into the streets together. And honestly, if you've never experienced La Noche en Blanco before, it can feel slightly surreal the first time you see it properly.
Because this is not just a few museums opening late. For one night, the entire historic center effectively turns into a giant open-air cultural map. Over 150 activities spread across museums, rooftops, churches, galleries, plazas, archive buildings, waterfront spaces, and side streets. With the whole thing running almost like a moving wave through the city. And what makes Malaga's version different is the scale of participation. This is not tourists watching performers. This is the city itself going outside together.
And you feel that immediately. The atmosphere starts changing before sunset even arrives. Terraces begin filling earlier than normal. Families arrive with children while the streets still feel calm. Musicians start testing sound equipment in hidden corners. People stand underneath balconies looking upward, waiting for performances to begin. And then suddenly, the entire center starts moving at once.
The official theme this year is "The Future is Written with Music." And Malaga is leaning very heavily into sound across the entire event. There are live balcony singers above Calilarios, synchronized performances down near the port, immersive sound installations, orchestral performances against projection mapping, and a project called The Sound Footprint, which is literally recording the voices and ambient sounds of the crowd throughout the night. So, in a strange way, the city is almost composing itself live while people walk through it.
And that's probably the part people remember afterwards.
Not one specific museum or one specific performance, but the feeling of turning a corner and discovering something unexpected. A choir inside a courtyard, a jazz trio hidden beside an old church wall, a hologram glowing blue inside a historic archive building, a rooftop suddenly filled with music, or just thousands of people standing completely still together while somebody sings from above the street.
And strategically, you need to approach the night properly. Locals already know this. Families usually arrive earlier, around 8 o'clock, while the atmosphere is calmer. Serious museum visitors start planning routes weeks in advance, and by around 10:30, the energy changes completely as the nightlife crowd fully arrives into the center. That's when Calilarios and Plaza de la Constitución become extremely dense, especially if the weather stays good.
And one of the nicest things about Noche en Blanco actually happens away from the busiest streets, because if the center becomes too intense, you can suddenly escape toward the waterfront. Mil Uno slows everything down again. You get the sea breeze back, the port lights reflecting off the water, people sitting quietly with drinks watching performances beside the Mediterranean, and the whole city suddenly feels softer again for a while.
Meanwhile, places like the English Cemetery become almost the opposite experience entirely. Quiet, lantern lit, almost gothic. You can still hear distant music drifting across Malaga from the center, but inside those gardens, it feels like stepping into another century for 20 minutes. And honestly, that contrast is what makes the night work. The city keeps changing personality depending on where you stand.
And by midnight, Malaga genuinely stops feeling like a normal Saturday night.
The museums are still full, the terraces are still busy, people are still queuing for exhibitions, musicians are still performing, the metro is still running, conversations are happening everywhere, and the entire city feels awake together.
Then eventually, sometime after 1 a.m, the official events slowly begin ending, but locals know that's not really the end, because that's when people start drifting into late-night cafes, chocolate shops, and churro bars around the center, talking about what they saw, comparing routes, deciding what they missed. And honestly, that's probably the real final chapter of Noche and Blanco.
So this week on the Costa del Sol really feels like the beginning of outdoor season properly returning now. Not just beaches, but plazas, terraces, museums, concerts, processions, late-night streets, and public spaces all filling up again together. And honestly, there may not be a better symbol of that than Malaga's White Night.
And while Malaga City spends next Saturday night looking toward the future through music, light, and technology, the rest of Andalucía this week still holds very tightly onto its older traditions as well. Because across the province now, we're moving into one of those very specific spring periods where villages, inland towns, and historic centers all begin stepping outdoors again for romerias, processions, patio festivals, and long community celebrations.
So after the modern energy of Noche and Blanco, we're heading back into the older heartbeat of southern Spain this week. Horse processions, flower-filled courtyards, pilgrimages into the countryside, open-air meals, church bells echoing through whitewashed streets. An entire town slowing down long enough to celebrate together properly.
So next, we're into festivals and traditions across Malaga, province, and Andalucía for week 20.
Malaga Radio.
And one thing that becomes very obvious this week is how much of Andalucía still lives outside.
Because while Malaga City prepares for projection mapping and late-night museum crowds next Saturday, inland towns and coastal communities are simultaneously preparing for horses, flower carts, pilgrimages, church music, and huge outdoor gatherings that have existed for generations. And honestly, this is one of the nicest weeks of spring to experience that side of southern Spain properly.
The biggest traditional anchor this week is definitely the San Isidro celebrations happening across multiple towns in the region. And what's interesting is that every place approaches it slightly differently. In Estepona, the San Isidro festivities transform parts of the town into something almost rural again for a few days. You get traditional dress, horse processions, communal gatherings, music, food stands, and eventually the pilgrimage atmosphere building toward Los Pedregales Natural Park. It's one of those events where tourists suddenly realize this coastline still has an agricultural identity underneath the beach image.
And San Isidro celebrations always create a completely different rhythm compared to normal tourist events. People aren't rushing between things. Families arrive early. Grandparents stay all day, children run around the parks, people carry folding chairs into plazas, lunches become evening drinks without anyone really planning it, and entire communities basically move outdoors together for the day.
Meanwhile, in Nerja, the Romeria de San Isidro has one of the most visually dramatic routes of the week. The procession starts near the Balcón de Europa before gradually moving toward the Nerja caves with pilgrims, decorated carts, and horses traveling together through the landscape. And by the time the celebration reaches the caves later in the afternoon, the atmosphere becomes much more like a giant outdoor social gathering than a formal religious event.
And there's something very Andalucía about that journey.
Because you begin beside the Mediterranean, with tourists drinking coffee on terraces overlooking the sea. And a few hours later, you're suddenly surrounded by countryside celebration, music, grills, dust, horse riders, and families dancing outside caves in the hills above the coast. It almost feels like the region revealing both sides of itself in one afternoon.
Then inland, places like Cártama continue the same tradition in a more local and community-focused way. The Romeria there still feels very connected to municipal identity rather than tourism. Bands leading processions, neighbors walking together, traditional clothing, long outdoor meals, and importantly, these events are not performances staged for visitors. Tourists are stepping into something already happening naturally.
And that's probably why people remember these weeks afterwards, because they don't feel manufactured. You hear church bells echoing through narrow streets, smell grilled meat and jasmine together, suddenly see horses tied beside cafes, and realize an ordinary Tuesday afternoon has quietly turned into a local festival without warning.
Outside Malaga province itself, the final week of the Fiesta de los Patios de Córdoba is also happening now. And honestly, if you are willing to do a longer inland day trip this week, this may be one of the strongest cultural experiences anywhere in southern Spain. Private courtyards across Córdoba open to the public, filled with flowers, fountains, ceramic details, and live music, with entire streets effectively turning into open-air social spaces throughout the day and evening.
And what makes the patios special is the intimacy of them. Noche and Blanco feels huge and cinematic, but Córdoba feels personal. You're stepping into spaces that normally belong to families and residents, hidden behind ordinary doors, with people still watering flowers, chatting from windows, or sitting quietly inside while strangers slowly walk through. It feels less like attending an event and more like briefly borrowing somebody else's Andalucía for 10 minutes.
Then later in the week, food starts becoming part of the festival atmosphere as well. Because in Ronda, the Feria Comarcal, Sabor, Málaga begins bringing regional producers, wines, cheeses, and gastronomy culture together in Plaza Blas Infante. And we'll come back to that later in food and hospitality, because honestly, that event deserves its own discussion.
So this week really feels like Andalucía reopening itself properly after spring's unsettled weather.
Villages stepping outdoors again, courtyards opening, pilgrimages moving through the hills, parks filling with families, plazas filling with music. And even if you arrive here expecting only beaches and cocktails, this is one of those weeks where the deeper personality of the region becomes impossible to miss.
And there are a few other traditional events this week worth keeping on your radar as well. In Osuna, the Feria de Mayo begins building toward another big Andalusian spring fair atmosphere with horse carriages, evening casetas, and celebrations around the Plaza de Toros. Algarrobo holds its Feast of the Virgen de Fátima this week as well, with quieter processions moving through steep, whitewashed streets above the coast. And across multiple inland areas, you'll also notice smaller local romerias, outdoor meals, and spring gatherings beginning to appear now as communities move fully back into festival season again.
And honestly, even if you don't plan these events deliberately, this is the kind of week where you accidentally discover Andalucía while driving somewhere else. A village suddenly full of music, a road briefly stopped for horses, a plaza covered in flowers, a church bell echoing through hills you weren't expecting to visit, or a long lunch somewhere that quietly turns into a local celebration beside you.
And after all of that tradition, pilgrimage atmosphere, and historic Andalucía, we're moving back toward the modern cultural side of the region now. Because this week, museums, galleries, exhibitions, and late-night cultural spaces across Malaga province are also having one of their busiest periods of spring.
So next, we're into culture and exhibitions across the Costa del Sol and Andalucía for week 20.
Malaga Radio.
And culturally, this may actually be one of the strongest weeks of spring so far across Malaga province.
Because what's interesting right now is that culture is no longer staying inside museums. It's spilling outdoors, onto streets, into courtyards, across rooftops, beside the port, through old buildings, and into spaces that normally just function as part of everyday city life. And obviously, a huge amount of that energy connects back to La Noche and Blanco Málaga 2026 next Saturday night.
But even outside the White Night itself, Malaga's museum and exhibition scene is extremely active this week. One of the standout exhibitions continues at the Colección del Museo Ruso, where Ana Pavlova, Una Vida Sin Fronteras, explores the life and legacy of the legendary ballerina through photographs, costumes, and historical archive pieces. And importantly, this is the kind kind of exhibition that works very well even for casual visitors because the setting itself, the old Tabacalera complex beside the sea, already feels atmospheric before you even walk inside.
And that whole Tabacalera area has a very particular feeling at the moment. You've got old industrial architecture, sea air moving through the streets, huge exhibition spaces filled with contemporary art, and then cafes and terraces outside full of people decompressing afterwards. It feels creative without trying too hard.
Just across the same complex, the Meet exhibition space is also hosting Vladimir Velichkovich Huida Vertigo y Caída, which leans much darker and more intense visually. So you've got this interesting contrast this week between classical elegance, experimental technology, political art, and contemporary installations all existing within a few hundred meters of each other. And that's exactly why Malaga's museum identity has become so strong internationally over the last decade.
Then down near Paseo de Redin, the MUCAC La Coracha exhibition, Val del Omar El Laboratorio Plat, probably connects most naturally with the Noche and Blanco atmosphere. Experimental cinema, light, sound, projection, technology, immersive visuals. It almost feels like a preview of the city Malaga becomes on Saturday night.
Meanwhile, the Museo Carmen Thyssen Málaga continues its Archipiélago exhibition featuring major works from the Suñol Soler collection. And for tourists planning cultural afternoons this week, that museum still has one of the best locations in the city because afterwards, you naturally spill straight back into terrace life around the historic center, which is something Malaga does very well now. Culture and hospitality blending together naturally instead of feeling separate.
And honestly, some of the nicest cultural moments this week aren't even happening in Malaga City itself.
Because in Vélez Málaga, the Feria del Libro continues filling Plaza de las Carmelitas with writers, talks, book stands, and public events. While over in Marbella, Galeria Isolina Arbulu is hosting contemporary exhibitions that feel much quieter and more intimate than the huge city museum experience. So culturally, the province feels very layered this week. Large-scale city energy, but also smaller creative spaces hidden around the coast.
And then there's probably one of the most locally important exhibitions of the week happening in Fuengirola. Fuengirola, the art of fishing at the Municipal Museum, explores the town's maritime identity and fishing heritage, which matters because towns like Fuengirola are changing very quickly now through tourism and development. And exhibitions like this help preserve the memory of what those places originally were before the apartment blocks, beach tourism, and nightlife economy arrived.
And honestly, that tension between old and new may actually be the hidden theme of the entire Costa del Sol right now. Ancient streets filled with projection mapping, fishing towns becoming cultural centers, historic archives using holograms, traditional plazas hosting digital art, and people moving between all of it in one evening without really thinking about the contrast anymore.
A few extra cultural mentions worth noting this week as well. The English Cemetery in Malaga continues becoming one of the city's most atmospheric evening cultural spaces. The Centre Pompidou and Picasso Museum will both see massive traffic around Noche and Blanco, and smaller galleries and independent creative spaces across Soho are also expected to stay extremely active right through next weekend.
So after all the museums, galleries, projections, exhibitions, and cultural nights,
we now move toward one of the other things the Costa del Sol does exceptionally well once spring evenings properly return. Long dinners, terrace culture, regional food festivals, wine, markets, late-night tapas, and entire towns quietly reorganizing themselves around eating outdoors again.
So next, we're into food and hospitality across Malaga province and Andalucía for week 20.
Malaga Radio.
And after weeks of unsettled weather, one thing is definitely returning properly across the Costa del Sol now. Long evenings built around food. Because this week you can really feel restaurants, terraces, markets, and outdoor dining spaces starting to reclaim the evenings again. People are eating later, staying longer, moving slower, and treating dinner as the main event instead of just part of the day.
And the strongest food anchor this week is probably the Feria Comarcal Sabor, a Malaga taking place in Ronda from Friday through Sunday. This is essentially a huge regional showcase for Malaga province producers. Cheeses, olive oils, wines, cured meats, pastries, honey, small artisan brands, and importantly, it's happening in one of the most visually dramatic towns in southern Spain. So the event itself almost becomes secondary to the atmosphere around it.
Because Ronda in spring already feels cinematic before you add food stalls and wine tastings into the middle of it.
You've got cliffs, mountain air, plazas full of people carrying glasses of wine, musicians appearing in corners, long conversations stretching across terraces, and then suddenly somebody hands you locally made goat cheese or sweet wine while overlooking one of the most dramatic landscapes in Andalucía. It's not exactly a difficult day out.
And events like Sabor Málaga also tell you something important about where tourism on the Costa del Sol is heading. The region is becoming much more food-driven now, not just beach tourism, not just nightlife. People increasingly travel inland specifically for gastronomy weekends, winery experiences, and regional products, and this event leans heavily into that identity.
Meanwhile, back on the coast, the terrace culture this week feels very alive again, especially in places like Malaga, Marbella, Estepona, and Fuengirola, where people are finally trusting the evenings enough to sit outdoors properly again after all the weather interruptions. And honestly, one thing this coast does extremely well is the slow transition between afternoon and night, coffee becoming wine, lunch becoming dinner, one drink accidentally turning into 5 hours.
There's also an interesting overlap this week between gastronomy and culture because Malaga continues holding its designation as European Capital of Gastronomic Culture for 2026 and 2027. And you can already feel restaurants leaning into that. More tasting menus, more local sourcing, more wine pairings, more experimental dining concepts, and more tourists specifically planning trips around restaurants instead of just beaches.
And one thing visitors sometimes underestimate is how social food still is in Andalucía.
Meals here are rarely quick. Tables expand, neighbors join, desserts appear long after everyone said they were full. And people genuinely build entire evenings around conversation rather than rushing somewhere else afterwards. Which honestly fits this week perfectly because so much of week 20 feels public and communal. Plazas full, markets full, patios full, terraces full, cities staying awake longer again.
The markets in Mijas also deserve a mention this week. The artisan and craft market atmosphere there combines food, ceramics, local products, and slow shopping culture in a way that works very well for relaxed afternoons rather than high-speed sightseeing. And that's another pattern emerging this spring. Tourists increasingly choosing experiences that feel slower and more local instead of just trying to tick places off a list.
And inland, the Axarquia region quietly continues one of the nicest seasonal food periods of the year right now. Late citrus harvests, mountain restaurants, small village dining rooms, local wines, and menus that still feel connected to the landscape around them rather than designed purely for tourism. It's one of the best weeks of spring for simply driving somewhere inland and stopping wherever looks busy. Because honestly, busy local restaurants in Andalucía are usually busy for a reason.
A few additional food and hospitality mentions worth keeping an eye on this week as well. Malaga City's waterfront restaurant scene is expected to be extremely busy around Noche and Blanco next Saturday. Puerto Banús continues shifting fully into summer-style day-to-night dining now, and across the coast, Chiringuitos are finally beginning to regain that relaxed evening atmosphere after a stop-start weather period through spring.
And honestly, food may quietly be the thing connecting almost every part of the Costa del Sol this week.
Festival lunches, late-night tapas after exhibitions, wine beside plazas, churros after Noche and Blanco, beach restaurants filling again, mountain towns slowing down around long meals, and people staying outdoors together much later than they were even 2 weeks ago.
Which actually leads perfectly into the next part of the week, because once the dinners stretch longer, the terraces fill up, and the cities stay awake later, the music and nightlife energy naturally starts rising with it as well.
So next, we're into music and nightlife across Malaga province and Andalucía for week 20.
Malaga Radio.
And musically, this week feels like the Costa del Sol properly waking back up again.
Because after a very stop-start spring weather period, you can suddenly feel nightlife, concerts, beach venues, and outdoor music spaces beginning to trust the season properly now. The terraces are fuller, the sound systems are back outside. People are planning nights ahead again instead of deciding at the last minute based on rain radar. And honestly, the entire coast suddenly feels louder this week.
And one of the clearest examples of that is the return of major concert energy at Mare Nostrum Fuengirola. Because next Friday, Paco Candela performs there as part of the 2026 concert season. And what's interesting about Mare Nostrum now is that it's no longer treated like just another venue. For tourists, it's becoming one of the defining Costa del Sol night experiences of the summer season.
Because the setting does a huge amount of the work. You've got the Sohail Castle beside the sea, Mediterranean air moving through the venue, trains still arriving from across the coast, people eating and drinking around Fuengirola beforehand, and then suddenly thousands of people are standing beside the water watching a concert underneath floodlit castle walls. It always feels bigger than a normal arena show somehow.
And this week's music landscape also reflects something broader happening across the coast right now. There's a very strong split between traditional Andalucía and international Costa del Sol nightlife. Because while Paco Candela represents one side of southern Spain culturally, places like La Sala by the sea are already moving fully into summer party season. Day parties, beach DJs, champagne service, international crowds, open-air terrace music, and long transitions from sunlight into nightlife.
And honestly, one of the nicest things about music on this coast is how quickly the atmosphere changes depending on where you are. Inland, you might hear flamenco echoing through a plaza beside horse processions, while 30 minutes away, somebody's drinking cocktails beside a DJ booth watching the sunset over Puerto Banús. And somehow both versions of Andalucía still feel completely normal at the same time.
Meanwhile, in Malaga City itself, music becomes part of the actual infrastructure of Noche and Blanco next Saturday. Balcony singers above Calelarios, live orchestral performances, sound installations, street musicians, projection mapping synchronized to music, and even the Sound Footprint project recording crowd noise throughout the evening. So, unlike a traditional festival where music happens on one stage, the entire city effectively becomes the venue.
And those are usually the nights people remember longest afterwards.
Not because of one headline act, but because they accidentally discovered music somewhere unexpected. A singer above a balcony, a jazz trio in a side street, a violinist inside a courtyard, a choir echoing through old stone walls after midnight. Those moments feel very Malaga somehow.
And the coast overall is also entering the phase where nightlife becomes more international again. You can already feel it in Torremolinos, Puerto Banús, Fuengirola, Málaga Center, more languages around terraces, more weekend visitors arriving, more beach clubs reopening fully, and more venues beginning to operate with summer pacing rather than spring pacing.
Which honestly changes the emotional rhythm of the whole region. Dinner gets later, drinks get slower, music starts outdoors earlier. People stop going home after sunset, and suddenly, even ordinary weekdays begin feeling slightly social again.
A few extra music and nightlife mentions worth keeping on your radar this week as well. Malaga's Soho district is expected to stay very active around Noche en Blanco with smaller independent performances and creative nightlife energy. Beach venues across Marbella continue transitioning toward full summer schedules. And Fuengirola's concert calendar is now accelerating quickly, heading toward the major summer season.
So whether your version of the Costa del Sol this week is
flamenco in a village square, wine beside live guitar music, castle concerts by the sea, late-night jazz during Noche en Blanco, or cocktails beside DJs in Puerto Banús, this is definitely one of those weeks where the region starts sounding like summer again.
And after all the city's concerts, terraces, and nightlife, we're heading back outdoors one more time now because sport, movement, countryside events, and open-air activity across the region are also accelerating very quickly again this week.
So next, we finish with sports and outdoors across Malaga province and Andalucía for week 20.
Malaga Radio.
And by the end of this week, one thing becomes very clear across the Costa del Sol and inland Andalucía.
People are moving again, properly moving, because after a difficult spring weather period, the combination of longer daylight, warmer evenings, and major outdoor events is suddenly pulling people back outside across the entire region. And honestly, Week 20 may be one of the first weeks this year where the outdoors starts feeling reliable again, instead of temporary.
And the strongest symbol of that this week is probably what's happening around Ronda and the surrounding mountains. Because even after the famous 101 kilometros La Legion weekend finishes, the atmosphere lingers. The trails remain busy, cafes stay full of exhausted runners and cyclists, and the entire Serranía still feels connected to endurance culture for days afterwards. And that matters because spring sports tourism inland is becoming extremely important economically now. Cycling, trail running, hiking, motorbike touring, road trips, outdoor weekends. The inland side of Andalucía is no longer just scenery people drive past on the way somewhere else.
And honestly, this is one of the nicest moments of the year to experience that landscape.
Everything's still green, the heat hasn't become exhausting yet. Wildflowers are still visible in higher areas. And villages that feel sleepy in winter suddenly become full of walkers, cyclists, and terrace lunches again. It's probably the closest Andalucía gets to perfect outdoor season.
Meanwhile, across the coastline, activity tourism is accelerating again very quickly now. Catamaran trips are becoming busier around Malaga and Benalmádena. Cycling routes along the promenade systems are filling up again. Water sports operators are expanding schedules. And beach walking culture, which sounds simple but is genuinely part of Costa del Sol lifestyle, is fully returning after weeks of unstable conditions.
And there's something very specific about the coast. Once outdoor rhythm comes back properly, people stop treating the beach as a destination and start treating it like part of everyday life again. Morning walks before coffee, cycling beside the sea, paddle before dinner, swimming at sunset, long walks after nights out. The outdoors quietly becomes part of normal routine instead of an activity.
Golf tourism is also entering a stronger phase now. Courses across Marbella, Mijas, Estepona, and Sotogrande are moving into one of their busiest seasonal windows before the extreme summer heat arrives. And importantly, this period attracts a different kind of visitor compared to July and August. Longer stays, activity-focused holidays, more movement between towns, more inland exploration, less purely beach-driven tourism.
And one thing the Costa del Sol does very well at this time of year is offering different versions of outdoors depending on your energy level. You can push yourself into mountain trails around Ronda or simply sit beside the sea in El Palo watching paddleboarders drift past while eating lunch slowly for 3 hours. Both somehow count as active lifestyle here.
A few additional sports and outdoors mentions worth keeping on your radar this week as well. Eco-dolphin expeditions continue operating from Puerto de la Duquesa this week, combining small group sailing with responsible wildlife watching along the western Costa del Sol. The ITF World Tennis Tour brings another week of international tennis activity into Marbella around the Rafa Nadal Tennis Center. Torremolinos hosts Día de la Bicicleta y del Patín next weekend along the Playa Mar seafront, turning part of the coastline into a huge family-friendly cycling and skating space. And inland in Archidona, the Ruta Senderista San Isidro Labrador combines hiking with traditional spring pilgrimage atmosphere through the countryside.
And honestly, that's what the Costa del Sol starts becoming at this time of year. Not just somewhere you visit, but somewhere you participate in. Cycling beside the sea, walking mountain routes, watching dolphins at sunset, playing beach volleyball after work, or just accidentally joining an outdoor event you didn't even know was happening that morning.
And by next weekend, warmer evening temperatures are likely to extend outdoor activity much later into the night than we've seen for most of spring so far.
And honestly, that may be the real story of week 20 overall.
Not one single event, but the feeling of the entire region gradually reopening itself again. Museums full, terraces busy, pilgrimages moving through towns, concerts beside the sea, markets reopening, outdoor dinners returning, cyclists back on the roads, people staying out later, and cities beginning to trust warm evenings again.
Which means before we finish, we should probably step back and look at what this week across the Costa del Sol actually feels like overall.
So next we'll wrap up the Málaga Radio Weekly Diary for week 20.
Málaga Radio.
And look ahead to the kind of week Andalucía is quietly becoming. And honestly, week 20 feels like one of those weeks where the Costa del Sol properly starts opening itself back up again. Warmer evenings, longer dinners, music outside, pilgrimages moving through villages, and cities staying awake later without needing a reason.
The weather settles down properly from here as well. By midweek, we're back into reliable spring sunshine across most of the coast, which honestly arrives at exactly the right moment, considering how much of this week is designed to happen outdoors.
So whether your week becomes late-night museums during Noche and Blanco, wine in Ronda, live music beside the sea, mountain walks inland, or just a long lunch somewhere that accidentally turns into sunset drinks. We hope this helped you discover something worth stepping outside for.
And remember, Malaga Radio continues every day across the week as well. Freshly Squeezed starts the mornings live from 8 a.m., following the real daily rhythm of the Costa del Sol as it happens, weather, events, traffic, beaches, nightlife, and everything shaping the day ahead. Then from 11 until 2, Feel the Pulse takes over with Mitch, Lumi, and Finn exploring the active side of the region, hiking, cycling, wellness, sport, adventure, and outdoor life across Andalucía.
Then Pia carries the afternoons from 2 until 6 with Factor 50.
Which honestly feels like the Costa del Sol holiday mood in radio form. Beaches, attractions, wellness, chiringuitos, slow afternoons, local discoveries, cocktails, sunsets, and all those small moments that make people fall in love with this coastline in the first place.
And from 6 p.m., Daniel takes over with Ice and a Slice, Malaga Radio's evening food and hospitality show. Restaurants, venues, terraces, cocktail spots, live atmosphere, and the kind of places people end up talking about long after the holiday finishes.
Plus, more than 200 Malaga Radio podcasts are now available across all major podcast platforms, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, YouTube, and Alexa.
You can also listen live anytime through malagaradio.com and the Malaga Radio mobile app. So wherever you are, the Costa del Sol can travel with you.
For now, though, thanks for spending part of your week with us.
And we'll see you next time for another Malaga Radio Weekly Diary.
Malaga Radio. Malaga Radio.